Welcome to the book club where the size is just right, the books aren't too long, and you never need to host. That's our job. We bring best-selling and award-winning writers of every genre to Twin Cities metro area libraries to share their stories, discuss their work, and answer those burning questions you've always wanted to ask your favorite authors. This is a book club where we don't have to argue about what the author meant. They can tell us. The book club that doesn't require a clean house or wine and cheese. And in this book club, if you haven't read the book, it's all right. Although, we hope you'll be inspired to pick it up next time you're in the library. I'm your host, Slade Kemet, and you can consider the book club rewritten because this is Club Book. Club Book is made possible by Minnesota's Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, MELSA, and Library Strategies, part of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library. We would also like to thank our partnering bookseller, Red Balloon Bookshop. This podcast features Tommy Orange at Scott County Library, Prior Lake. Pulitzer Prize finalist Tommy Orange is an enrolled member of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes of Oklahoma. His chart-topping debut instantly established Orange as a gifted chronicler of the contemporary Native American experience. There, published in 2018, tells the interlaced stories of 12 characters from urban Native communities, all of whom converge for an important powwow in the author's native Oakland, California. In one of the myriad of glowing reviews, Lakota Times summarized Orange's debut as a page-turner, filled with multi-generational accounts of violence, recovery, memory, identity, beauty, and even a little despair. There garnered a host of honors, including the prestigious PEN Hemingway Award and the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize. Orange's awaited follow-up, Wandering Stars, hit shelves in February. In this book, the author traces the legacies of the notorious Sand Creek Massacre of 1864 and Pennsylvania's assimilationist Carlisle Indian School through 3 generations of a fractured but resilient family.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm going to read a little from the book. This is the UK cover. For some reason, they do it differently. And I'm going to talk afterward about the title for both There and this book, and the titles and the way the titles happened. Two very different stories from 2 very different books, even though they're supposed to be very closely related. There's a lot of heavy subject matter in the book, but I'm going to read from a scene from one of the characters in the contemporary part of the novel, because there's a big historical piece at the beginning. The DNA test was a birthday present Tom got for the whole family. How's it a birthday present for me if everyone gets one? Sean had asked Tom, suspicious it was related to him being adopted, for them to find some kind of commonality despite not having any blood relation. The whole thing was dumb, but what if there was no shared DNA? Wouldn't that have been worse? Tom handed Sean a wad of cash, which may or may not have been the question's response or an impromptu part of the birthday present. The results from his spit were emailed to him. The spit said he was white from Northern and Southern Europe, Native American from North America, and black from the North African region. He'd already assumed he was part black because he knew what he looked like. Because people know what they look like. And because of the way people had always looked at him in the white community he grew up in, there was no mistaking the look you got if you were assumed black or part black in a white community. Whether you were or were not all or part, with or without the data regarding your DNA. But everything about race and background was trickier when you were adopted. Sean didn't feel he had the right to belong to any of what it might mean to be black from Oakland. And he couldn't pretend to now be Native American, not white either. But he would continue to be considered black, holding the knowledge of his Native American heritage out in front of him like an empty bowl. Being part white was something he'd just assumed. Even if he hadn't been white, everyone was raised with whiteness as the standard and as the gaze, so you had it in you even if you didn't. It was the background sound you only ever noticed got turned off in rare moments when the spotlight shifted temporarily. Before Sean Price knew what he was in terms of DNA results, he'd done a project he was assigned for his social studies class called I Am Oakland. One of the kids in his class was actually named Oakland. Oakland Lee was his full name. Oakland was adopted like Sean. They'd been friends before middle school. They used to take the bus together. They rode Oakland's different bus routes all over Oakland, and it was scary for both of them. That was part of why they did it. Something having to do with both of them knowing they were black and taking the bus through neighborhoods in Oakland where mostly black people lived to prove something to themselves and to each other. Oakland Lee had lighter skin than Sean, and this, he told Sean, made it harder for him to do what they were doing. But mostly they didn't talk about what they were doing. Talking about anything more than was necessary would have made it impossible to keep doing it. And before they knew it, what had begun as some kind of test or rite of passage or competition became a way for them to just not be noticed, to not be one of the only people of color in the spaces they occupied, to not have eyes on you like that. Became for them how to disappear completely. They'd each been listening to music from their phones, watching the rest of Oakland, not from up in the hills, but down where its real people lived, where the stakes felt higher and what people said and felt had this realness and this urgency that always felt more to Sean what being alive was supposed to feel like. As it turned out, the commonality found on the test between him and his dad and brother, besides being white, was Native American heritage. Sean was a quarter, and they'd found out they were 12.25% Native American, so half of a quarter. The thing you want to be able to do is to live with the idea of your ethnic background, form an identity with it so that by the time you go to write your college essay, you'll really sound like you know what you're talking about, Tom had said. And here was the real reason he wanted Sean to take the test. Because even though he was perfectly fine with his son taking his homemade drugs and selling them, it was never not emphasized that he would be going to a college, and a good one, a respectable one, and certainly not off to a military academy like Mike. Don't be like Mike was their father-son mantra when they talked about the future, if Mike wasn't around. I'll no more know what I'm talking about than I do now. The test isn't a history lesson. It certainly isn't a cultural education plan or whatever you think you mean by living with the idea of my ethnic background. Also, ethnicity and racial makeup are completely different things. I just want you to have cards to play when the time comes. I thought being adopted was my card. I thought mom dying was a card. Me being not white, growing up in a predominantly white community in Oakland, aren't those my cards? Not white in a predominantly white community in Oakland, that sounds too vague. Where's the story? How does America fit in? Now the Native American part, what about playing that part up? You got more than me on that part. Stop saying part, Sean said. What? Tom said. Sean and his dad were talking on the phone from separate rooms of the house. Sean was in his room, elbows perched on his knees, holding the phone in front of him with both hands and white earbuds strung up into his ears, scrolling through news headlines as his dad audibly paced the kitchen downstairs. The kitchen floors, for whatever reason, were the creakiest in the house. I'm like a quarter by percentage according to a test. Play up being a quarter according to a DNA test, Sean said. That's not a story. Yeah, maybe not, but I'm part Indian now too. We have that together, you know. Don't say Indian. I said part. Stop saying part. It's not an insignificant amount, Tom said. This feels gross, Sean said. There might have been a chief in our line. We're not from the same line of people just because. There's nothing wrong with it, Sean. It's our heritage now. Now? See how that doesn't work? The shit doesn't land on you. Does not arrive in the mail, Sean said. It's ours. It's who we are. It's science, son. No, it's not. Not really. How so? I don't know, but it's not science. Genealogy is a science, the study of genes. It's right there in the name. All the ologies are sciences, not cosmetology. You know what I mean. Fine, but it doesn't mean you have the experience. It's abstract data about our DNA. I heard it's flawed because the data sets are mostly white people. I heard they stole native data. They can't take from us what we are, the stock we come from. You sound stupid. I'm telling you, Sean, I feel chief energy, Tom said. I'll stop there. So, I feel like They're There as a title. How many people have read They're There? A lot of people. They're There as a title and as a book was something that I sort of chased after and pursued with a kind of passion. And that experience, and I'll go into where They're There came from as a title. That experience differed with Wandering Stars. I felt like something was happening, and I'll explain this so it doesn't sound crazy, but I felt like it was happening to me. The book was happening to me, whereas with They're There, as with the title, I went after it. So I first came to, I was researching for a grant that one of the characters in They're There ends up going after for a storytelling project. I did the same thing. I went in front of a panel of judges and was presenting on doing a storytelling project that was collecting stories from Native people in Oakland and sort of how they got there, what their experience of being Native people and being in Oakland, what that means, being urban Native people. So the research I was doing was around what other Oakland authors had to say about Oakland. And one sad part of the literary landscape and it not having very many Oakland voices is that you have to go all the way back to Gertrude Stein and Jack London to hear anything about Oakland. And Jack London doesn't really write about Oakland. He writes about the wild, or that's what he's known for anyway. And Gertrude Stein, literally the only thing she wrote about Oakland was that there was nothing to say about Oakland. And the quote is, "There is no there there." So in her book, Everybody's Autobiography, a character asks another, "Why don't you write about Oakland?" And she says, "There is no there there." So that unfortunately has been taken up by Oakland haters for whatever reason to say that Oakland has no soul or characteristic to define itself as a place, which is, anybody who knows Oakland is not true at all. But that's not what she meant. Gertrude Stein grew up until she was, I think, 14 or so in Oakland on like a farm land, and she left and came back, and when she came back, it was all developed over. So when she said there is no there there, she just meant it was developed over. So I came across that quote and also found out about the history. Again, I was just researching about what people said about Oakland. I'm not a classics reader. I'm not a Jack London reader. I'm not a Gertrude Stein reader. I can't pretend to be. I wasn't a reader in high school. I came to reading on my own in my 20s. But there was something in this quote and the story that I was able to find on the internet about this quote that spoke to the Native experience. And I was writing about urban Native people and the experience of like, what does it mean to have a relationship to cities, to be a Native person and to be from a city. And it's not, it's not a familiar way that people see us depicted. And yet, for more than a decade, 80% of us have been living in cities, and we've been moving to cities since the 50s and 60s. So we have a deep relationship to this connection to major cities across the US. Some of the highest population of Native people are in the biggest cities in this country, and it's just not the way that normally we're thought of. And that's, that's mostly because we only think of Native people as, related to 400-year-old pilgrim history. That's the time that we think of Native people as like November pilgrims or like, cowboys, Indians, and other Native depictions that we are familiar with and comfortable with and so get perpetuated. I once did a profile of Wes Studi, our most prominent Native actor, and the way that he told me that he stayed as a working actor for all these years, and it's been like a 30-year, 40-year career, and he said it's leathers and feathers. That's the way that he's able to stay working, and that's because movie studios, TV studios, that's what people want to see, this same story. So in thinking about the urban Native story and with there, and I promise you I'm coming to a point about titles, and I'll move on to Wandering Stars and its story in a second. All I had a file, so I save everything in Google Docs. That's where I work because I have a history of sleepwalking and erasing actual writing on my computer. So I started storing everything in Google Docs and not on a local computer because I've like literally erased a bunch of writing in my sleep. So the file folder where everything for there was kept was called There Is No There. Everyone can agree it's a clunky title. That's not going to be a title for a novel that's going to do, like, it would never have made it through the people who decide on title names. And I knew it wasn't, but it was just a placeholder. And so it wasn't until 2014, I'd been working on the book for a few years, working in the Native community, writing first thing in the morning. I would write for a few hours before I went to work. And then I'd often read stuff to my wife. She worked in the community as well, and just trying to figure out what writing a novel even was. This was my first attempt. And so I landed on There as a title in 2014 when I was at a writing residency in New Hampshire, and immediately loved it to the point that I Googled it to make sure nobody else had this novel title already. And the first thing that comes up is a Radiohead song. And I love Radiohead. And I knew the song, but I didn't know that it was called There, because I pirated the album that it's on, which the album is called Hail to the Thief. And I knew the song as track 09. It's the 9th track on the album, because the person who uploaded it to Pirate Bay didn't title the track. But it was There, and I looked at the lyrics for it, and it was just because you feel it doesn't mean it's there, and we are accidents waiting to happen. These are like refrains in the song that matched perfectly with my vision for the novel at the time. So I immediately was like, There, that is it. And that was, a few years in, and a lot of writing and a lot of figuring out, like, what is this book. I don't know. So that was the story of getting to there. And it's almost the complete opposite for Wandering Stars. And I've just started telling the story because I'd never thought of it. It just happened. And that's how stories go. They happen first and then you tell them. So with Wandering Stars, a few months before There was published, I finished writing There without any idea of what the next book would be. There was actually like a 10-day period after I finished where I fell into really dark depression because I didn't realize how dependent I'd become on like having a project to work on. I've realized now that like I always have something lined up. And that's, indication that I'm not the healthiest person in the world. But it truly, like I always have things sort of going on for when things end. And so in March of 2018, a few months before There came out, this is the most unromantic place to think of your next book. But I'm just being honest, this is where it happened. I was signing 5,000 copies of There at a warehouse north of Baltimore, at a Penguin Random House warehouse. And there was a team of sales reps that were what they call flapping. They just they give me the books to the right page and I sign them so that we can do it as fast as possible. They had played a Spotify playlist with The Root as There by Radiohead. And in the middle of this signing, which like forever transformed my signature because it was crazy to do that for, like 8 hours a day for 2 days straight. The song Wandering Star by Portishead came on as part of that Spotify playlist algorithm. And this is the part that makes no sense, that I'm still trying to figure out how to talk about. But immediately, I knew I was going to write a sequel, and it was going to be called Wandering Stars. And even Wandering Stars specifically, that's not even the name of the, weirdly not the name of the song by Portishead, but when you hear it, she says Wandering Stars, but it's called Wandering Star. None of this matters. I don't know why I'm explaining it right now. But I knew in the moment, Wandering Stars. So I start writing a very straightforward sequel that picks up where There left off. And it's just like the first scenes that I wrote were literally about birds like pecking at leftover food in the stands, sort of looking at the empty powwow and feeling like this big bay breeze blowing through the whole stadium or coliseum. So a year later, after way too much travel, and I'm not gonna stand here and like complain about success, but I was burnt out on traveling. I was traveling because I was doing stuff for There, and I'm very lucky to have that experience. But I was burnt out, and I was asked to go to Europe for 3 different translations of There. So it was Italian and Dutch and Swedish. And so I was like, my agent was like, you definitely should go. Like translation's hard, like to sell American literature in foreign places. It's not the easiest market. People don't necessarily care about what we're doing over there. So I agreed to go, and on the way we were going to stop at a Lunar New Year festival at the Oakland Museum, and we parked at an Oakland BART station notorious for break-ins, and I secretly wished that all of my stuff would get stolen. We were only going in for a half hour into the thing. We were meeting up with family. We were going to see briefly like a lion dance, and like literally just in and out. And left everything in the car. And it's horrible to wish this, but I was like, please just take everything and then I won't have to go. Because I didn't want to travel anymore. I was full of anxiety around any kind of travel. So I go into the thing and we come back out and the window's broken and everything is gone. Like my son had like a paper bag of like dinosaur toys, that was gone. My wife had jewelry that was just personal, not valuable. Everything gone, my passport, my laptop. And so I'm like, yes. Even though like financially it's horrible, but we have like insurance and I know we can get it replaced. So I call my agent and I'm like, I guess I can't go. And she's like, no, you have to go still. And so she's familiar with these situations, and I go to emergency passport. And it just meant that I missed the Italian part of the trip, which is like the best part. So I go to Amsterdam and Sweden. And I'm in Sweden, okay, so I'm writing the sequel. It's just the aftermath of the powwow from there. I'm in Sweden, and the organizers asked me to come to a museum while I'm there, and I'm like, sure. I don't like museums in particular, but I don't want to be rude. And they start the tour, and sort of like it's this new meta tour that I think a lot of curators give now of like, we know it's wrong why we have a lot of this stuff, but we still have it now, so do you want to see it? And they had like Southern Cheyenne, like my tribe stuff specifically, and they're like, do you want to see it? We know how problematic, but still, do you want to see it? And I did see it, and there on the wall next to one of the displays was a clipping of Southern Cheyennes in Florida in 1875. So I know enough about my tribe when I see this to know that we were never in Florida. And basically, I fall down this rabbit hole. So I'm already writing this, this sequel that I have no intentions on writing anything historical around it, but I for whatever reason became convinced that Wandering Stars was the name. So as I start reading about this historical moment that I soon find out is the basis for boarding schools, which is like one of the most devastating pieces of U.S. policy and action ever taken that was not war and massacre based against Native people in our culture and life ways and languages. Just decades of this. And I realized my tribe, half of the prisoners of war that were taken to this prison castle were Southern Cheyennes. And so I become fascinated by this part of history because it's my tribe, and I don't ever hear Southern Cheyennes referenced. Cheyennes themselves sort of aren't as well known as we used to be. We used to have books written about us, and there was like a 70s or 80s movie with Dustin Hoffman called Little Big Man, which is kind of a quiet classic. So I dig into this history, and I find out that the Star Castle, the prison castle, was shaped like a star. It's called a star fort, and they have these kinds of forts because of the way that they're designed, the positionality of cannons and the way that they can see out from where they're positioned is just, from a military position, somehow smart. So I realized the prison castle that I'm writing about is shaped like a star, And then I find a list of prisoner names, and one of the prisoners' names is Star, and another is Bear Shield. And that's one of the families from there. And I realized in that moment that I'm gonna write a sort of generational saga thing that starts not at the prison castle, but actually at the Sand Creek Massacre, which is a story that I grew up hearing from my dad, who he grew up hearing from his great-grandmothers. He was raised by grandmothers and great-grandmothers in a much more traditional way than even a lot of men and women from his generation, just because he wasn't accepted by his mom or dad. And he spoke Cheyenne was his first language, and he spoke in this way that sometimes he would even be made fun of by other kids for talking like old people. Like his Cheyenne is an older Cheyenne. So he grew up hearing this story, and he grew up telling us this story. And I knew that there were people that fled from the massacre who ended up at this prison castle, even though it was many years later. So I realized I wanted to try to write a family line that started at the massacre, the shooting at Sand Creek, that ended up in the aftermath of there. And wandering stars and the stars that kept appearing in the writing and in the research that I was doing, it just felt like it came to me this time where I was like completely convinced at the outset, for whatever mysterious reasons, which was a much different experience than writing there. Of course, both books took 6 years to write, and both were hard for very different reasons. And writing a novel is hard work. Working on any piece of art for a long amount of time, if you're someone who is inclined toward self-hatred and self-doubt, is not. It's doubly hard. But I think a lot of creative people, that is also the tool that you're using to create is the self-doubt piece. The self-hatred piece is sort of the double-edged sword of like, well, how do you keep looking at your own work and making it better? You have to kind of hate yourself to put yourself through this work, but also to be able to like really look at like how, if you believe in yourself too much, you're just gonna like say the second draft is fine. You have to kind of like keep digging. You have to be the kind of person who constantly doubts in order to get to the 27th revision point and be like, okay, this is good enough. And that's the furthest I think you can ever get, is sort of the good enough point.
With that, we have reached the part of our podcast where we turn to our club book audience for questions and comments for Tommy Orange and his work. In this book club, we like to encourage members and authors to connect and engage and help bridge the gap between the page you read and the process it took to write it. Our first question of the night comes from an audience member wondering about the inclusion of spider imagery in There.
So I was writing There. I had already written in some spider themes, some language around spiders and stories. And this was late 2013, I think. Summer 2013. So I, like the character Orville Redfeather in a West Oakland Target bathroom, pulled spider legs out of my leg. So I actually did that. There was like a bump on my leg, and then there was pointy stuff coming out of it, and I pulled it out, and there was like, 2.5 inch long legs with bends in them. I pulled 2 of them out, and I came out of the bathroom like, just, my wife said like all of the blood was out of my face, just like I had them on toilet paper, just like holding them for her to see. And so I scoured the internet just like Orville Redfeather to figure out what it was, and there was nobody who was talking about pulling spider legs out of legs anywhere that I could find. And so I called my dad, because I was like, this might be a native thing that I don't know about. And so I described everything to him, and he said, it sounds to me like he got witched. And I was like, okay, well, what do I do? And he said, I'll pray for you. And that was it. That was all he had for me. So I decided I didn't know what to do with it, the information, the real information of it happening to me in my life, and that it seemed more like something that should be happening in fiction. And so I gave it to my character and had it work as like a foreshadowing of like the powwow. I just had nothing else to do with it. I had to do something with it. So that's what happened.
This audience member asked when Tommy Orange began writing.
I started writing after I got my undergrad in sound engineering. So I was a musician first. And after college, I realized there wasn't any job that I could get coming out of college. And I got a job at a used bookstore, and I started reading and writing just on my own, just completely, just started loving it on my own terms, nobody telling me what to read. And for the next 9 years, just did that on my own. But the moment that really made a difference, it was a year into writing There. My wife was a project director on a Native youth suicide prevention grant. So I'd been working in the Native community at that point for, like 7 years, 8 years. And she was my girlfriend then, but also like the mother of my newly born baby. And she knew I was writing the book. I was only reading it to her. Nobody else knew I was doing it. Nobody else really knew I was even writing. It was a very private thing that I felt, because I wasn't a reader or a writer in high school or as a young person, so I felt like I was just playing catch up, and it's just not something that I even talked about. I just was just doing it. So we, on this Native Youth Suicide Prevention Grant, she decided to do, among other things, we had a lot of different projects we did for the youth. Like we took them to the reservation and had them experience Native youth, up in Northern California, the Yurok tribe. And we had the Yurok kids come down to the city, and they both got to experience all of that. And we took them to Alcatraz and had elders tell them stories about the occupation. And then my wife and some other colleagues decided to put on an author panel. That's what they were calling it. And she made me be a part of it. And I'm like, I'm not an author. I've published nothing. Nobody knows I write. This thing that I'm working on, like, you're the only one who's ever read it. And you expect me to read to the Oakland youth who, like, they're not impressed by anything. And I was already close to them, like, just as a sort of counselor figure. Yeah. But, like, to read, like, a raw thing that I wrote that's scary to read to anyone, to read to them, I was like, I'm not doing that. And she was like, well, you are, I'm your boss. So we did this symposium, whatever, panel, author thing, and I read from part of There that still exists in the book, that was just talking about being an urban Native person. And the kids had a completely overwhelming emotional reaction to it. And 2 kids were crying, and they had all these questions. and it felt like I was speaking to something that was their experience. And that was the first time I was like, oh, what I'm working on matters more than whatever I thought I was writing for. That if it could reach these Oakland Native youth in an emotional way, that was the first time where it felt like, and that was a year into writing there, where it felt like this means more than I ever could have thought it could mean, just the writing process and whatever I thought the book was going to be.
Our next question comes from an audience member wondering if it was difficult for Orange to find a publisher for his first book.
Yeah, I mean, getting into an MFA is a part of accessing the publishing world, and I think I knew that. I was sort of anti-MFA before I got into mine. I would read a lot of like author bios after reading, a sample of pages from new books that were getting a lot of attention or buzz, and I felt like the MFA was killing voice and originality, and it was like putting out safe books that were like very New York focused in an annoying way. And then I found out about the Institute of American Indian Arts MFA program, and that there was like faculty that was Native and it was full of Native students. And I also knew when I applied to the program that to teach an MFA, you have to have published a book. That means everybody who's teaching has access to the publishing world. So I went into the program knowing like I would learn something more about how to access, because it's like this weird thing. Like if you don't know about the publishing world, it's this mysterious, like, how does it happen? How do you go from writing something to, it's this crazy mystery thing. And so I went through the program, and I had teachers that liked the work, and I had, this is, so much is about luck and timing. Like I worked really hard. I wrote from 2005 to 2018 was all just, didn't get published anywhere. And I was just working hard on my own and reading and writing as much as I could. So it's not like I won the literary lottery, but I did in a way, because I ended up with one of the best agents in the industry who is part of the reason why I ended up at the publisher that I'm at Knopf. But it happened the timing is crazy because, so end of 2016, I'm finishing what was at first my thesis for my MFA. And I had a lot of support from teachers, but nothing panned out. People had said they were going to send stuff to their people, and nothing actually happened. So I did a reading at a writing conference, and somebody there loved it. And they were like, I'm going to send this to my agent, send me your manuscript. So I sent my thesis to her, and nothing happened. A month went by. But this month that went by was the end of 2016, and Standing Rock was happening on national TV, and everybody was seeing how horrific that was, and Trump was getting elected. And so the day after Trump got elected, she sent my manuscript with a glowing, amazing email to her agent. And my agent, who was up with anxiety 4 days later because of the Muslim ban and having family, Muslim family, she read it at like 4 a.m. and found hope in the prologue to There. And so because of the timing of that, it went out in a way, like it sold like a month after the inauguration, and the political landscape and what was happening with the country and people, thinking this return to greatness versus people like, thinking that my manuscript was speaking to some truth that we needed to be looking at the same time, had everything to do with the way the book got launched. So a lot of different factors. It's a very long way to tell you. There's a lot of different factors to how I ended up with the publisher I ended up with. But it wasn't like, it wasn't, it's not easily explainable. It had to do with timing and with being connected to people through an MFA program and, crazy things happening in the country at the same time.
This member from the audience wonders about Orange's process and if he listens to music while writing.
Yeah, like 98% of the time I'm writing, I'm listening to music. And the other 2% is when I'm reading the work out loud in the revision process. And I'm not listening to music when I do that. So I both of those things, even though it's a smaller percentage, the reading out loud, the listening to music while writing I think it's vital to the process for me. I don't know what else to share. I run a lot to think about writing away from the page, and that leads to a lot of like structural answers that I can't think of when I'm at the page. I think this can also be driving and walking. I think there are ways to like turn off the writing brain and allow another thing to come through, another way of thinking to come through that happens when you don't think you're thinking. That is the better part of you thinking. That I have found through running, but I think there's other ways to find it by leaving the page and trusting that there's other ways to get answers about what you can't figure out at the page.
Our next question is what authors Tommy Orange's books are in conversation with?
Yeah, very different books. I would say for there was like definitive ones like Let the Great World Spin and Marlon James's Brief History of Seven Killings and Jennifer Egan's Visit from the Goon Squad, Louise Erdrich's Love Medicine. These were all there sort of direct conversation ones. With Wandering Stars, I read all of Toni Morrison for the first time and was, I could not have been more impacted by the power of her language and her storytelling. So that was, I don't want to say that it's in conversation because I don't even deserve to be in conversation with Toni Morrison's work, but that's an influence on what I was doing in the book, was directly influenced by reading all of her work in a certain time period. Oscar Hokea's Calling for a Blanket Dance was a really crucial book during a crucial moment when I was figuring out how to write in a generational way that sort of moved all the way through a family line, which there were versions of Wandering Stars that were very much like jumping around through time. And I was convinced that this generational linear way was the more powerful choice. So his book was important. I can't think of any right now off the top of my head that, but that's what I could think of right now.
Our last question of the night comes from an audience member asking about how much of Orange's personal life is reflected in his characters.
I mean, I think I give generously from myself to my characters. I write a lot of interiority, especially in Wandering Stars. And the things that I'm pulling from are directly from me. And it's easier to pull that off with interiority because I think we all live much more expansive and diverse inner lives than is known. I think we all understand more and are more complex in our interiority. And that's part of why we can connect to books and to stories of all different kinds, because we live rich inner lives. And so I pull generously from the inner part, but obviously also from the outer part with the spider legs. And, there's all different ways that, like, my wife will read something that I've just written and she'll know exactly what I'm talking about on a personal level. She'll know like when I wrote it and what I'm writing it about, and none of that will be apparent in the writing. So I'm like processing personal stuff through characters, and including personal stuff that is not apparent, that is it, you know, I hate to get into the conversation about art therapy and like this idea of is it cathartic, because I think that's too simplified. But I do process myself and the world and reality and history through writing and through story and through my characters. And I think the inclusion of what I'm feeling and thinking about is essential in that processing. So I'm constantly throwing things in and taking things out, and if it works, then I keep it, and if it doesn't, then I don't. But nothing is like too precious to spare from like the experiment of, could this work for writing? That might sound sociopathic, but I truly try to like bear everything on the page.
That wraps up our Scott County Library event with Tommy Orange. Make sure to catch our next podcast with John Scalzi. Science fiction superstar John Scalzi is the author behind the New York Times bestselling Old Man's War series, the award-winning Interdependency trilogy, and beloved standalones like Red Shirts and the Kaiju Preservation Society. His latest, Starter Villain, is a tongue-in-cheek subversion of classic supervillain tropes. Visit us online at clubbook.org for details on past and present seasons, sign up for our e-newsletter, check out our calendar, and so much more. Stay up to date with all of our events at our Club Book Facebook page. If you're on Twitter, find us using the handle ClubBookMN. And if you enjoy these free Club Book events and podcasts, remember to share them with your friends. They just may too. Thanks again to all those who make Club Book possible, including Melsa, Library Strategies, and Minnesota's Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Our sponsors include Red Balloon Bookshop, where you can purchase all the books featured in Club Book. Finally, a very special thank you to all the libraries hosting events this season. That's it for Club Book, the coolest club in town. We'll see you at the library.